Feminine desire. Creeligi. There is no escape for you from this scene, Sydney. I hope you know what you've gotten yourself into. The lights flick on, revealing Sydney to their harsh white light. He's strapped naked to a crossbeam, spread eagle, exposed, fragile, unprotected in any way, and at my mercy. You squirm in the light, but slowly adjust and take in your surroundings. It's a smallish room. There's a few tables with equipment and many tools laid out, but the main focus is you. You're isolated and trapped here, completely restrained, and at my beck and call. Your hands are bound to the crossbeam with metal shackles, your waist is bound with rope, and your ankles are pulled far apart. I can see that you've tried to struggle. I can see the chafing on your arms and ankles. But it didn't work, did it? Okay, it's time for your examination. You look over at me. You know who I am, you know what I represent. Your head rests back, almost in relief, as though I had woken you from a dream, but you realize the reality of this place. I run my fingers up your legs and give your cock a light flick. You wince, I grin. That is the way it works around here. I check your body for bruises and welts. There's some welts on your butt and a few scratches on your back, but your balls have stopped swelling, which means you are ready for another session. I'm impressed, Sydney. Most men don't recover as quickly as you do. It's only been 8 hours since your last session. Thank you, Mistress Caroline, you murmur, still drowsy from the sudden wake-up. I can see your eyes drinking me in. I know you worship me. If you don't, you will learn to. I see your gaze absorbing the sight of my full red lips, my soft, sensual skin, and delicate yet fierce makeup and my shiny black hair. You see my blouse, barely able to hold my breasts, and my skirt that hugs my body and accentuates my ass and legs. You hear the clicking of my heels as I circle you like a shark, and you'd better believe I've caught the scent of blood. I stop, standing between your legs. You stare down at me as I take your balls in my hand. Your eyes portray both fear and excitement, an intense and anxious combination. I clench my fist and crush your balls under my grip. I love it when you groan. I can never tell if it's pain or pleasure. I feel myself getting wet, but today is not for me. There are other plans. Though I can't devoid myself of all the fun. I squeeze again, this time slapping your cock as I do. I grin. I'll have my fill later. Time to go. I click my fingers and 2 women enter. They gag and blindfold you whilst they unshackle you from your bed and push you on your knees. They cuff your wrists together and drag you out of the room. The session. Good morning, ladies, and welcome to this demonstrative seminar on the means and methods of female domination. I'm glad to see so many strong, beautiful women here, ready to take their man by the balls and put him in his rightful place. Staring across the room, I see 20, perhaps 30 women of various shapes, sizes, and ages. There's a lot of younger women, in their early 20s maybe, I smile, as a wave of expectation and excitement takes hold. Gives me hope for the future. Today, our session will be on the topics of ball busting, impact play, humiliation, and torture. All of these things are vital in ensuring obedience in your plaything. Sometimes, even a submissive can get too confident, too big for their boots, and need to be reminded where their place is, and it is your job to ensure they get that reminder. The crowd of women nod. I can see the excitement in their eyes, the joy in their smiles. I see it with every class I host. Today is a special day, ladies. Normally, our demonstration models are men in need of some punishment. We receive a lot of disobedient males, and our task is to break them down and rebuild them, remold them into our perfect, subservient man-slaves. But today is special, at least for me. May I introduce you all to Sydney, one of our latest projects. I raise the curtain that blocks our gaze. Through the one-way mirror, now revealed, is the demonstration chamber. The room is full of every tool a woman would need to bring a man to his knees and keep him there. I see you, Sydney, shackled to that Y-frame. Your hands are bound above your head, your legs forcefully spread open, to allow easy access to your delicate and pathetic manhood. Even from here, I can see the sweat on your body, as the bright light above illuminates your muscular body. The women crowd around the window, gawking at you as though you were a zoo animal. I hear murmurs of attraction and amusement from my class, as I let them swallow your eye candy body. As you can see, he is positioned in such a way that he has no choice but to accept his punishment. The rope that binds his hands is tight and was tied by one of our most tenacious rope experts. The steel shackles on his legs will ensure he cannot flail or dodge, and the big steel belt around his waist means that he can't even shuffle in place. He is as rigid as the frame that holds him, and he knows what he's due. There is no escape for Sydney. I explained to the class the various tools on offer: whips, canes, belts, cattle prods, and these new toys that resemble a small ball on a stick among various other toys. And now to introduce our doms for today. 4 beautiful women enter the room. They are all distinctly different. Goddess Nyx is a sadism specialist and one fierce bitch. Nyx nods her head. Her aesthetic is nothing short of dark and devilish. Thigh-high boots, fishnets, and a black corset that accentuates her breasts. Her skin is almost entirely covered in tattoos apart from her neck and face, and her hair is shaved on one side. Mistress Natalia hails from Russia. She has a knack for all things electrical. Natalia has striking blue eyes and dirty blonde hair. She's incredibly gorgeous and incredibly firm. Her legs are long and muscular, her butt is plump and round, and she's wrapped in beautiful, tight latex and vinyl. Mistress Amelia is one of, if not the strongest woman I've ever met. She currently holds the Academy record for forceful submission of a male in the shortest time. All she did was beat him in an arm wrestle, and he was practically worshipping her. Amelia flexes her arms. She's wearing nothing but tight latex shorts and a bondage harness that only just covers her nipples. Her muscles are on full display, and they are incredible. And finally, Madame Dominique, she's a different breed of dom. Fancy, classy, feminine, and a force to be reckoned with. Dominique steps forward and grins wildly. Her body is perfect. Shapely, slender, smooth, and sexy. Her high heels are delicate, and her blouse was something you'd see on the catwalk in Paris. Her blonde curly hair gave her a look not unlike Marilyn Monroe, but more fierce. In you go, girls! The crowd watches as the 4 women enter the chamber with Sydney awaiting. He visibly tenses up at the sight of them. Some of the class notices and murmur with anticipation. Fear and respect go hand in hand. Each of the ladies has a specialty, and they will each showcase their own brand of punishment upon our slave. But first, a bit of group therapy. Watch how the ladies bring him down verbally first. Hey, slut, Nyx spits, standing right between Sydney's legs, his balls in squeezing range. Good morning, Mistress Nymph. His words are silenced as Amelia forces a ball gag into his mouth. I hate it when they talk, don't you, Dominique? Amelia laughed. Oh, yes. I prefer the helpless, muffled screams of my victims, Dominique retorted. God, look at this pathetic excuse of a man, Amelia continued. Do you know how easily I could break you? Sydney affirmed, nodding his head. Do you know easy I could have you worshipping me? Shall we try these first? Natalia asked, distributing various riding crops, whips, and tools to her fellow mistresses. Nyx takes the first swipe, wielding a stick with a large rubber ball on the end. The tool lands squarely on Sydney's testicle. It felt as though someone had thrown a tennis ball at his crotch. He winced and whimpered through his gag. Before he could recover, Nyx swung again, this time hitting his inner thigh, leaving a red imprint. He screamed, only to be thwacked again on the other thigh. The impact noise was so sharp it made some of the onlooking students wince and scream quietly. Nice, Natalia acknowledged, raising her riding crop and slapping it down onto Sydney's cock. Pathetic worm, she exclaims, sliding the tip of her instrument over Sydney's clean-shaven crotch. Amelia takes her turn, swiping upwards from below Sydney's restrained body with a wooden cane. Her weapon connects with the bottom of his scrotum, and they bounce upwards from the impact. Sydney whimpers pathetically, as his tormentors laugh at his expense. The girls all collected tools, similar to Nyx's ball on a stick, and stood in a semicircle in front of his balls. Then, one after the other, they swung their implement and hit Sydney's balls. As soon as one had finished, another woman would take its place and intensify the writhing and pain. Sydney shook and moaned with every impact, as the women hurled insults and degrading comments at the helpless prisoner. "Hey, let's play a game," Nix smiled. "Hood the slave, and he has to guess which one of us is hitting his worthless manhood." "I love that," Natalia added. Emila withdrew a hood from a drawer and fixed it over Sydney's face. His whole world went black, and he was left to wonder when the next impact would strike. "Okay, slave, if you think it's me," Nix explained, "hold up one finger, 2 for Tanya, 3 for Emila, and 4 for Dominique. If you get it wrong, we get to all punch your balls. Got it?" She asked. "Doesn't matter anyway, you belong to us. Prepare yourself." Nothing happened in Sydney's cut-off world for a few moments until he suddenly felt an insanely sharp, crushing pain in his scrotum. Someone was squeezing his balls with their hands, and it made a sick feeling well in his stomach. Sydney raised 3 fingers. He assumed the strength of the grip could only be that of the muscle queen. "Good guess," Emila chuckled. Then nothing. A short wait and a huge impact sent shivers up his spine. 2 fingers. "He knows us well," Natalia replied. A brutal, sharp, splitting pain resonated across his scrotum. It felt like someone had smacked him with a wooden cane. 1 finger. "Wrong!" Dominique laughed. "Punishment time!" Sydney felt Emila's tight grip wrap around the rear of his balls, leaving the front exposed. A sharp, brutal impact made him splutter as Emilia punched into her own hand, sandwiching his balls between her fist and her palm. Then, another pain, and another, as all 4 girls had their way. They continued this game for 4 rounds until Amelia remarked, "God, I can't wait for my demonstration. I am so fucking horny to pound this whelp." The fear in Sydney's eyes grew immensely. He had felt her grip, her fist, her fury. "Go ahead, Amelia." They lifted the hood off Sydney, and Emila turned and faced the one-way mirror and smiled. She nodded to the other girls. "You know the position," she remarked. They got to work enthusiastically, systematically untying Sydney and repositioning him. He offered no resistance as they handled him like a rag doll. Emila dragged a pair of large boxes over, and Sydney was placed on top of them, on his knees, with his genitals suspended between the 2 boxes. His legs were bound at the ankles and secured to bolts on the floor, and his arms were outstretched and roped to separate latches on the ceiling. The other girl stepped back, with Natalia giving Sydney's balls a playful slap. "Good luck, little slave," she mewed. Emila stood before Sydney, staring him down with a wicked grin. "You're mine now, pet," she smirked. She began to circle him, rubbing her muscles and stretching as though she were about to work out. His eyes glanced over her derriere and the tight nylon shorts that barely covered her butt cheeks. Her nearly naked body glistened with sweat in the warm light of the chamber. Her legs, muscular and strong, flexed with every step. She grabbed her ball on a stick and stopped behind him. His balls dangled helplessly between his legs. She swung her tool with huge force and connected with his butt, which jiggled in a manner that Nix found appealing. Sydney cried out and exhaled painfully through his nose as she swung again, this time impacting his balls from between his legs. The force of the blow took his breath away. Watching him buckle over in pain, and while he still writhed, she slapped his butt once more with the ball, loudly giggled at the spectacle, and then tossed it to Nix. Emila placed her hands on the back of Sydney's shoulders and took a half-step backwards. She tensed her arms, showing the mass of muscle she had. She leaned backwards and charged her knee straight into Sydney's waiting balls. The impact was visceral, and Sydney bellowed out a painful, muffled howl. "God, this gets me so wet," Emila breathed, and infused with adrenaline excitement, as she prepared to ram her knee into him once again. "It makes my knees weak." Pushing down with her arms and up with her leg, she tensed all of her leg muscles. Her button thighs tensed into pure muscle as her breasts bounced in sync with her movement. She leant into the movement and her knee connected with his balls, crushing them against his body. He screamed and writhed in pain, fighting against his suspension. You could see Emila's anticipatory juices moistening her tight sports shorts as she knelt below him. "Let's really put this submissive to the test. Most men pass out after this," Emila exclaimed, staring up at her victim. He could see what was coming next. Her hand snapped up and with a closed fist began pounding his genitals as though it were a boxing bag. He winced and cried with every punch as Nyx, still holding the ball on a stick, began to wallop his ass. "Destroy his worthless balls," cheered Tanya. "He'll never need them anyway," mocked Dominique. The pounding lasted for nearly a minute, but for Sydney it felt like an eternity. Amelia had actually worked up a sweat from her workout, and as she stood, she intentionally drove her knee into his crotch once more. Surprisingly, despite the ball-crushing beating he had endured, Sydney was still conscious. He looked pale and sickly, and drool was dripping from his gag. "Impressive slave, I'd love to have a personal session with you. Would be good to break you and make you my own personal bitch." She pumped her fist in a celebratory cheer. "Can we use him as a boxing bag later?" she asked. The other ladies giggled at the idea and affirmed their interest in doing so. Amelia gave him one last kick in the balls and passed the stage to Tanya, who addressed the onlooking crowd. "Ladies," she began, "fists and whips and canes are fun, but they lack the sophistication of my favorite tool." The strong Russian lady opened a set of drawers and extracted a copper-colored rod with a pair of prongs on the end. Even through the one-way mirror, she could hear the women cheer in awe as she waved the cattle prod around. "Amelia, if you will," Natalia directed. Amelia lifted Sydney's cock, and Natalia placed the prod between the base of his shaft and his balls. She stared into his eyes and smiled wickedly before flicking the device on. Sydney began to convulse in shock as the prod electrocuted his genitals. He screamed and spluttered with every jolt she gave. She showed no mercy and just laughed at him. She stopped briefly to reposition the prod directly on his balls. She held the button on, and the voltage flowed into his scrotum. His flailing caused his balls to bounce away from the prod, only for gravity to bring them back into contact. Like a violent game of tetherball, Natalia continued to shock him, whilst the other girls took turns spanking their helpless submissive with whips and canes. "This one can take a beating. He might be my favorite one so far," Natalia declared, turning to the mirror. "Mistress Caroline, may I keep him?" She smirked. "No, Tanya, he's the Academy's. He belongs here." "Shame," she laughed as she forced the prod back into his scrotum. He convulsed and screamed in agony as she grabbed his balls and forced them against the electric prongs. She held them there until she was satisfied, which took a few seconds at least. "I've got more in me. What about you, slave?" she laughed, grabbing his cheeks and forcing him to nod. "Great, Amelia, my love. Please pass me the contact taser." Sydney's eyes widened and excitement expectation flowed. A drug. The cattle prod was severe enough, but this was going to be agonizing. Amelia passed the taser to Natalia, who kneeled behind their plaything. His balls were eye level with the fierce Russian woman. She waited until she could feel him tensing up with anticipation, then she struck, shoving the taser into the base of his balls and pushing on the trigger. The taser cackled, and Sydney's balls received the full brunt of the device. He shook and convulsed as she teased him on and off with the device. The girls laughed, but quietly. Natalia was impressed by Sydney's constitution. Despite the harrowing torture they had inflicted on him thus far, he was still conscious. "New position," Natalia declared. "Oh, which one?" Nyx grinned. "Remember that 3-hour session last week?" Natalia smirked. "You bet I do," Nyx moaned, her crotch becoming progressively wetter with excitement. The whole room was beginning to smell of sweat and the liquid anticipation of the women as they enjoyed themselves at Sydney's expense. Unable to breathe through his mouth, all Sydney could smell was their sex and their sweat. It only furthered the feeling that he was at their whim. Even the air was scented with his captors, and there was nothing he could do about it. The women circled him, each with juices flowing from their crotch. They unshackled him and placed him on a table. He was bound spread-eagle whilst Natalia fastened his cock and balls in a device reminiscent of a pair of stocks. His balls, now with nowhere to retract to, would have to face the absolute, full brunt of their torture. Amelia rushed and jumped onto the table, swinging a barefoot kick into his confined balls. He screamed in agony as the girls laughed at him. Amelia placed her foot on his crotch and stood as though she had conquered a mighty foe. She pressed her heel down, pushing his testicles against the wooden device that kept them in place. The pain was excruciating and sent tingling nerve pain all through Sydney's body. To add to the pain, Natalia once more applied the taser to the base of Sydney's shaft, and he cried out. Natalia soon swapped back to the cattle prod and inserted one of the prongs into Sydney's urethra and turned on the device. It made a small buzzing noise as it emanated an electric shock that shot straight through Sydney's body, making him quiver in pain. Oomph, 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 oomph. His eyes were watery and he looked as though he might pass out. Steady there, girls. We don't want to knock him out, yet. Emila lifted her heel and Natalia retracted the taser. Nix, do you want to show my students how to humiliate and degrade a submissive into submission? Fuck yes, I do. I am so ready for this. She laughed, indicating towards the dripping fluids from her panties. Ladies, ask yourselves, what's the best way to emasculate a man? Nix asked. The onlookers muttered amongst themselves. Some offered answers, all were wrong. You make him feel like a sissy girl, she mewed. Dominique, care to help? I'd love to, Goddess Nix, she replied, and Nix stood in her corset and thigh-high boots, with her exposed panties saturated with her excitement. Her ass was practically swallowing her underwear, showing off her nice, round ass and the intricate tattoo work that ran down her thighs. Dominique, being almost exactly the opposite of Nix, wearing a white blouse and tight red pencil skirt, her skin completely void of ink, approached her with a series of leather straps and a dildo. More than that, Nix continued, you make him come like a sissy girl. Emila, Tana, make our little bitch here assume the position. Dominique wrapped the straps around Nix's curvaceous waist and ass. When she was finished, Nix stood proudly, wearing a cock that put Sydney's to shame. She danced around, showing it off to the onlookers who cheered and laughed, whilst Natalia and Emila manhandled their slave. They stood him up and attached shackles to his wrists, which were then connected to a pulley system hanging from the ceiling. They slowly raised Sydney off the ground, suspending him by his wrists. Then they similarly bound his ankles, and then the women hoisted him off the ground. Soon, Sydney is in a position reminiscent of crawling, though upside down and in the air. His cock and balls are exposed, as is his asshole. Amelia picks up a jar of petroleum jelly and sexually applies it to Nix's strap-on, before using her fingers to rub it all through Sydney's backside. Sydney quivered slightly as her fingers slid into him. Tanya, thinking ahead, blindfolds Sydney. From sheer exhaustion, Sydney's head drops and hangs limply as Nix approaches him. Ready, sissy? She laughs. Oomph, Sydney replies meekly. She places her hands on Sydney's knees and guides the dildo into his asshole. At first there is resistance, and Sydney began to squirm uncomfortably, but as Nix begins to thrust slowly, he begins to make small moaning sounds. Ladies, it's not all just about him, though, Nix laughs. This strap-on has a clitoral stimulator on it, and as I thrust into our little bitch boy's man-pussy, I feel deep, pleasurable vibrations. The challenge here is to make him come before I do, she moans. Sydney, trying his best to hide his moaning, can feel the gentle vibration of her stimulator. He fidgets in fear as he slowly begins to enjoy the experience. Demanding further control, Nix grabbed his cock and balls with one hand, squeezing them between her fingers. She uses them as leverage and guides him up and down her cock with his own balls. Oomph! Both Sydney and Nix moan in unison. Care for a drink? Natalia asks, offering a glass of wine to Nix, who takes it without question. She continues to pound deeper and deeper into Sydney as she sips the wine and moans with pleasure. Suddenly, the strong smell of wet vagina pervades Sydney's nose, and as he gently rocks back and forth from Nix's strap-on, he feels something wet and slightly hairy against his nose. You can tell I'm enjoying this, can't you, slave? Comes Amelia's voice. Oh, you are so naughty, Dominique laughed as she watched Amelia finger herself right in front of Sydney's blindfolded face. Nix squeezed harder as she began to really pound deep into her slave. Sydney moaned wildly, and she felt his balls tighten and retract slightly. A soft, gentle, pulsating feeling formed in her hand as euphoria filled Sydney's body. Oomph! 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 He cried as his cum exploded everywhere. Fuck, that's hot, Nyx moaned as she continued to thrust deeply, savoring the vibrating sensation. Like her captive slave, the euphoria soon shot through her body and she quivered in orgasm. Her knees buckled and she dropped down but kept her hand firmly clenched on Sydney's balls. Shortly after, Emila also came from her own activities, and she moaned passionately. Natalia picked up a moist towel and dabbed the cum off of Sydney's body before twirling the towel and flicking it into Sydney's crotch. The end of the rope whipped into his scrotum and sent a violent shock up his body that caused him to jolt. He swung limply from the ceiling as the girls anticipated their next move. They all looked at one another and then at Dominique. It was her turn, and they knew exactly what she wanted. They unbound Sydney and dragged him over to a vertical X-frame and restrained his wrists and ankles with the metal shackles bolted to each end of the frame. When they were done, he was left in a standing spread eagle position with his swollen red balls on full display for the doms and the class. Dominique stepped in front of him, her long slender legs covered in delicate fishnet stockings. Her arms highlighted her beautiful pale skin. Her breasts were spilling out of her blouse at this point, swinging around hypnotically, and her skirt was moist with sweat and anticipation. She was gorgeous, stunning even. "Class," she proclaimed. "Even when your submissive is spent," she slapped his bulging balls. "There is still a lot you can do. Punishing them for coming is always an option." She turned to face Sydney, whose eyes were transfixed on her body. With a glass of wine in her hand, she approached him, rolling her breasts around with her hands, flicking her nipples with her fingers. He watched attentively as she slid her hands down her body, licking her lips seductively. His eyes were mesmerized by her, that he failed to notice her hand stealthy, approaching his swelling, semi-erect penis. In a fell stroke, her hand clenched around his balls with a tremendous force, causing his gaze to be broken and to let out a huge, muffled cry of pain. "You came without permission, slave," Dominique spat. "Now you will suffer. More." She tightened her grip. A pulsating wave of pain and unease spread through Sydney's exhausted body. He was too tired to scream anymore. She lifted his balls and poured the wine onto them. The alcohol stung like hot fire on his red, swollen balls. It caused a renewed sense of anguish in their submissive as he flailed helplessly against his restraints. "You're going to come without permission again, slave?" she mewed. He shook his head and whimpered as the pain continued. She smiled, clenching her fist again. As she held his balls as though it were her property, the other girls approached, mockingly slapping his body whilst filling his mind with humiliating comments about his pathetic manhood. They swarmed on him, taking turns hitting and abusing his crotch and ass. Nyx returned with her ball on a stick and was pounding his ass cheeks, whilst Dominique continued to rub the stinging alcohol on his crotch. They unshackled him for one last impromptu activity, binding his wrists and suspending him from the ceiling and binding his ankles together with rope. "Time for a workout," Amelia cheered, taking a boxer's stance before him. The other girls surrounded him and took their own aggressive posture. Nyx held him firm to stop him from spinning, whilst Amelia began to pound into his stomach and crotch with her fists. Her muscles bulged from each impact and sweat exploded off her body. Her fury buried itself into his body as he screamed. His balls were bruising and turning blue, and he could feel the lasting pain of every welt she was giving him. Natalia took the next turn, this time taking her aggression out on his butt. She preferred her feet and was kickboxing his limp body. Drool was spilling out of Sydney's mouth as Nyx clamped her hands over his balls, using them like a joystick to rotate him towards Dominique, who vied for the open hand, assaulted him with a series of cock and ball slaps, which left Sydney feeling a stinging sensation throughout his body. Lastly, Nyx, with her ball on a stick, took one massive swing from below him, connecting with the bottom of his balls. The impact sent his testicles into his body, and he spluttered through his gag. "Enough, ladies. The demonstration's over. Take him to get cleaned up." The doms groaned in dissatisfaction, just as Nyx was about to swing again. They spent a few moments cleaning up before they unshackled their submissive, and Emila hoisted him over her shoulders like a sack of dirt. As you have seen, class, subjugation of a male can be achieved in many styles, varieties, and methods. Every dom has their own unique twist on dominance, and with Sydney was dragged into a tiled room and dropped on the floor. His gag was removed, and he was placed in a collar with a leash attached, that Nix held the other end of. He was given a drink of water and a nutrition bar, which he consumed slowly as the ladies stood around him, watching his every move. His balls were a brilliant, almost impressive array of reds, and his cock looked as though it were hiding from its tormentors. His body was bruising already, and there were welts that matched the hands and fists and toys of the women. As he finished eating and drinking, Nix tugged on his leash and told him to stand with his hands against the wall and legs spread. His hands were shackled to the wall, and his legs were held in place by another spreader bar. Once again, his balls were dangling loosely and in danger of being abused once more. This was, of course, the intention. Amelia lifted a high-pressure hose and blasted him with a torrent of water. She directed the first jet directly at his balls, and Sydney, feeling the impact, lost his balance, leaving him hanging against the wall with a raging blast of water shooting straight into his balls. Amelia continued to hose him down as he screamed against the pain and the cold. Once they felt he was washed, she turned the hose off. Natalia stood behind the shivering submissive and drove her knee into his balls one last time before unshackling him and dragging him on the leash like a dog. He crawled meekly behind her as they led him into his personal chamber. Dominique approached him and knelt beside him. "You did well today, little pet. Not many could withstand such torture," she mewed, kissing a few of the impact sites on his body. "You are a credit to all of our slaves," Amelia added, stroking her hand through his hair. Nix took out an ointment cream and began to rub it over his body and over the bruises and welts that were forming all over him. "You took a beating. I only wish my slaves were as good as you," Natalia smiled. "What is your secret, slave? How do you handle such pain?" Nix asked. Sydney looked up at the four powerful, sexy women who stared back down at their property. "I volunteered for this," he admitted. "What?" Nix exclaimed. "I thought all our slaves were unwilling?" Sydney shook his head as they strapped him down to his bed, his X-beam. Nix gave him a small kiss on his forehead and ran her fingers down his thigh as she left, leaving him to recover for tomorrow. Epilogue. "Sydney, wake up. You open your eyes as I run my hand down the welts on your thigh. You are still tender from yesterday's demonstration. I can see the swelling in your balls and the impact marks from their welcomed abuse. Is this the fantasy you were hoping it would be?" "Yes, Mistress Caroline," you reply meekly. "It's better than I hoped." "You can still back out if it isn't. There are plenty of other volunteers." "No, I want this," Sydney smiled. "I feel this is where I belong. Under your boot, under your control, under all of their control." "Good." I withdraw a notepad and pen and begin to take notes. "Yesterday's session? Incredible. The Doms? Beautiful. I loved each of them and would serve all of them willingly." I sit beside you, taking down all of your feedback. The things you loved, of which there were many, and the things you disliked, of which there were very few. You had found your home, as my slave. You had found your purpose, to serve. You had found where you belonged as long as you obeyed. That was the condition after all. You serve and obey, and the rest of your life will be your dream fantasy, a fantasy of being controlled, humiliated, and degraded. Your 2-week trial period is over as of tomorrow. If you don't back out now, we own your life forever. I know, you smile. And if you disobey us after today, the punishment is severe. Far worse than anything you'd endure under our loving care. I know, I'm happy here. I belong here, mistress. I smile. I know you do, dear sub. I stand and exit the room, watching you, grinning with glee as I do. I enter the adjacent room and softly smile at you through the one-way window. I can see you are happy, you are whole, despite the pain. I turn and face the 30-odd women awaiting my teachings. Good morning, class, and welcome to today's class on the means and methods of female domination. Today's lesson is about subduing your submissive through the notion of ball busting. Copyright C. 2024 Sydney D. Orr.